I'm Scott Al Miller. This is my life living in León, Nicaragua. I do a lot of videos for expats, and a recurring theme in the questions that I get, and this is truly something that I receive, one of the most heavily questioned topics is how do I find a job in Nicaragua? And it's an answer that we give all the time. You can't work here. And people just hear it's a challenge, go find a loophole. But the real answer, more deeply, the really core thing that you need to understand is you do not want to work in Nicaragua. Why? We're going to explain right after the bump. We have to be really adamant about this, because if we allow the slightest crack in the veneer, if there's any chink in the armor, people will glom onto that and try to find a reason, try to create an excuse to want to look for a way to find the possibility of working in Nicaragua. And that doesn't fundamentally make sense, because you don't want this to be true. As an expat moving to Nicaragua, assuming you're coming from the Western countries, you're coming from North America, you're coming from Europe, you're coming from Australia, New Zealand, whatever, unless you're coming from destitute Central Africa where there's a war going on and you're a refugee. If you are a refugee, that is different. But if you're watching my show, generally you are not, right? You are coming to Nicaragua because you can come to Nicaragua, not because it's the only place that's accepting you. And you do not, under any circumstances, want any feeling of wanting to work in Nicaragua. This will harm you. You don't want to feel this way. You don't want to want that, right? So why? So the first of all, you can't, but that's not important, right? Because as soon as we say you can't, someone's going to look for, and everyone is, we use this term, an askhole, right? Meaning you ask people until you get the answer you want, and that's everyone does, right? So this is not a unique thing. And this video isn't for any particular person, but this is something we see constantly. People will ask until they get this answer. And what they'll do is they'll find anyone who's willing to say they got a job in Nicaragua, and they'll leave out things like, well, it was actually an illegal job. They were an illegal immigrant. They were going to be deported at some point. They were deported. They were simply working under the table, like any number of things where you're not actually legally working in Nicaragua. You're just getting money and doing a crime, right? So that's important. And I've talked to people who've been hired by major places, right? This is just not something that you want. The amount of money that it is possible to pay you is not going to be a number that is going to make sense for you, right? That's really core. Don't worry about whether or not you could. Let's assume everyone can get a job in Nicaragua, right? But as an expat coming here, it doesn't do the country any good. So there's no reason for you to, on like an ethical level, to want to take a job in Nicaragua. Absolutely not. If it's an ethical thing, and I'm not saying it's unethical to want a job, but if you felt the compelling need to work because you thought by working a job in Nicaragua you were going to pay some ethical debt to the country for allowing you to live here, that's a wonderful reason to have wanted a job, but that's not what's going to help them. That would harm the country, maybe just a tiny bit, but it's not helpful. So you don't want on that side of things to have that desire. That's a misplaced desire. If you want to do good things for the country, you either want to live on retirement, that helps, or you want to work remotely, whether owning your own company abroad or working for someone else abroad and simply bringing in your salary, doesn't matter. What that is so good for the country. That does so much good. Taking a job here does harm. Just a little, but a little. So you don't want to take a job here for that reason. But a lot of people have this, like they haven't thought through the economy. They aren't aware of the unemployment crisis. So they don't realize that what feels like helping isn't, right? If you were to do the opposite, if you were a Nicaraguan and you moved to the United States, then the thing you can do to repay the country for allowing you to live there is to take a job, because the United States has more work than it has people to do. But Nicaragua has more people than it has work for them. So the needs are the opposite, and how to help is the opposite. So if that was the reason, then you don't want a job here. If the reason is you want to pay your bills, then certainly you do not want a job here. Why? Because minimum wage here is just over $200. In some industries, it can get as high as about $300. We're talking per month here. If you are looking at the highest normal paid professional ranges, right, doctors and lawyers, that type of thing, you're looking at a few times minimum wage. You could be looking at something like between $400 and $800 per month as kind of common. And if you're doing specialty work where generally very much speaking English, possibly a developer, something like that, something very technical, something that the country has very few of and a high demand for, then you could be looking as high as maybe 1,000 or a little bit more. And managers with a lot of skill that are running those things may get a little bit higher still. Those are the general ranges of what you could be making. Now, if you apply that to what you could be making with a remote job from US, Canada, Western Europe, and so forth, it is in the most extreme circumstances, which you can't do as a foreigner. As a foreigner, you aren't qualified for those higher jobs because you're a foreigner, right? Imagine if you were having a call center in the United States and you had, 50 Americans sitting in a call center and they're all doing jobs, and you said, okay, we're not going to promote one of you to be the manager. We're going to bring in a manager from another country who may have some knowledge, may be really good at what they're doing, but they're not from your country, so they don't have that cultural connection. And we're just going to bring someone in from, name the place, Japan, to manage you. You're going to have an abrasive situation. People are going to be like, how is there no American that can manage us and have this cultural affinity? That doesn't make sense. Of all the things, that's not a skill set you bring in from the outside. When you bring in outside help, it's either because you simply need more labor than you have people for, or you're bringing in technical expertise from the outside that you don't have. Just managing workers isn't one of those things. It cannot be. So that is always something you don't have access to as a foreigner in a legitimate business. So you're never going to get to those really high-paying jobs. And realistically, you're never going to be able to be a doctor or a lawyer in a different country. You're not licensed to do that. Even if you are magically permitted to do so, you're not licensed. So you would be starting over in a completely new career path in the hopes of getting up to $400 or so. And as a foreigner, you'll always be at the low end of any pay scale, not at the high end, because you always bring with you more challenges. You are not as easy to deal with as a local, same as anywhere else, right? This is a universal rule around the world. Being a foreigner in a workplace puts you at a disadvantage. The only advantages you have are maybe you came from a place and had some education that you wouldn't have somewhere else, or maybe you have some exposure or experience with something, so you're able to get into a job you may not be able to get in your home country, but anyone who's local and has those skills will do better than you, right? It's just the nature of things, basic economics, basic employment. We just don't think about this context because it's not something we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So if you're looking at working in a call center or anything like that, you are likely going to be on the lower end. You have very little competitive advantage to try to get your salary up. In theory, you could work at a call center in Nicaragua if you were allowed to. You will never be allowed to. Doesn't matter. But you could, in theory, be allowed to do so. And those salaries can get as high as maybe $800 per month if your English is absolutely perfect and you're quite good at customer service and you're willing to go sit in a cubicle in a call center all day long. But importantly, that's $800. That is not very much compared to, say, minimum wage in the United States. That's below U.S. minimum wage. But if you were to do remote work for the U.S., you would get at minimum wage and possibly more, because if you're good enough to be doing call center work, you might be able to get $8, $9, $10 an hour rather than $7 or whatever the minimum wage is now. Plus, you'd be working presumably about 168 hours per month, right? And so if you're making $10, right, that would be almost $1,700 per month coming in salary from the United States, whereas you're looking at $800 from Nicaragua. Now, 10 might be on the high side per hour, but if you got up to just that 10, just that tiny bit above minimum wage, I guess that's a noticeable amount above minimum wage, you would be at double the top pay scale for Nicaragua. So you'd be giving up the advantage that you have from the U.S. market to get the best job that's reasonably possible in Nicaragua for the same amount of working hours or less, because in the U.S. they would be paying by the hour, and that 168 would turn into roughly $1,700. Here in Nicaragua, they expect call center workers to be above 40 hours per week, so the amount you would be getting per hour of work would be even more dramatic. So the U.S. job would be more than double or nearly double, even if you're at minimum wage. It would be roughly double what you could maximum get in Nicaragua. But the story doesn't end there. In Nicaragua, they're always going to make you go into a physical call center building. So you have to commute in. That's going to have cost, very low cost. This is Nicaragua. But cost in your time is real. Almost always those jobs are in Managua. Any that pays well is in Managua. So you've got to travel by bus. So presumably a minimum of 30 minutes in and 30 minutes back every day. So that 9 or 10 hours per day in the office is now 11 hours because you got to ride the bus or even take a car or do a long walk. That's all time away from your day. So suddenly you may be putting in a 60 to 70 hour week getting to and from work and so forth to make half what you would make doing a 40-hour week in the United States. Plus, very importantly, if you are making a salary from the United States here in Nicaragua, you are tax-free. Neither the U.S. nor Nicaragua are going to tax you for any kind of job in this category. You are completely tax-free. So you are able to bring in that money from the outside and have, in this example, $1,700 that you actually get to take home and use. But if you're working at a call center in Nicaragua, you have to pay INS, or the local income tax. That's going to take at least 20% off the top. So what you started with as half is much closer to 1/3 now. So now you're doing quite a bit more work, not getting to stay home, and working and earning 1/3, having 1/3 the buying power of what you had. Plus, at the end of the day, if you're making that salary from the United States, like we said earlier, you're doing the maximum good for Nicaragua. You are bringing in all this benefit and you are helping yourself. And by helping yourself, you're helping the country. But if you took that call center job here, you are taking a job away from a Nicaraguan and not bringing in outside money. So you are both taking a Nicaraguan who needs a job and leaving them destitute. And now it trickles down, right? You would not be, the person you took a job would find some not as good job, and then that would take from someone else who'd find some not as other good job, and eventually there'd be a person who doesn't get a job because you took one, right? A whole bunch of people would be minorly impacted and one person would have no work. That's basically how that ends up working. But by taking a job, someone in Nicaragua loses a job, and by not working abroad, the entire economy doesn't have that money coming in from the inside. Everyone loses, and you lose a lot by wanting to work in Nicaragua. And that's if you can get that call center job, if you're willing to go into and do all those things. If you do anything else, you're simply competing with people who are much lower income for their jobs. And then the equation of what you could do if you're working remotely for the US or Canada or whatever becomes even more dramatic. So that's why we cherry pick the call center job, because it is the highest normal pay job in the country that you could get, right? Doctors and lawyers, you can't get that as a foreigner, even if you were here and had the right to work and all those things, right? You would have to start school over and be half a decade away from being able to practice, and you'd never be as good as the locals, again, because they grow up with it. They just have more access to things. So once you run these numbers, it should be crystal clear that economically, you have no desire to work in the country. And I understand some people are like, but all of my skills are with my hands. All of my skills are physical. I want to do manual labor. Maybe it's very technical. Maybe it's very skilled. Maybe it's very specialty, but it is manual, right? It's not going to be an exception. It's unfortunate that makes it a little bit harder, right? But there's no job market for Americans to be doing manual labor here in the country, or for any foreigner to be doing manual labor. There are Nicaraguans to do that. There are Nicaraguans to train to do that if necessary. And so we're looking at the best case scenario. It should be absolutely clear that when you're trying to do good for Nicaragua, the best case scenario isn't good enough to want that job. And from a personal economic perspective, the best case scenario is so far from you wanting to do that job. Nobody wins when you want a job in Nicaragua, but most of all, you don't win. And so that's why we say you don't want a job in Nicaragua, and why we want to drive that home. Because what happens is that the moment someone finds any reason to think that they would want a job here, one, they stop thinking about all the economic factors. They stop saying, what would the reality be like? What if I managed to get a job? How bad that would be. And so what they do is they constantly look for loopholes. They try to find stories of someone who got to work in Nicaragua, and they leave out key things. Like, are there ways to be able to work in Nicaragua? Actually, there are, right? But it's dangerous for us to say so, because the instant I do, everything else, their ears shut down, and they're like, I'm not listening to logic. I heard that I can work, right? And they miss things like you have to be an absolute specialist. There's no one else in the world that can do what you're able to do. Or you have to be an investor and have bought that job. And in order to do that, you have to prove on a reliable basis that you've created multiple other jobs. So yeah, you can buy the right to work by creating other jobs with a lot of money, right? Minimum of spending $30,000, waiting time to have it approved and filing with the government. and you have to keep providing multiple jobs. So if this is purely an exercise in how much foolishness can you do, yes, if you can come up with $30,000 and invest in a business here and hire multiple Nicaraguans and prove to the government that you are doing so, and then say, in order to do all this, I want a job here for no good reason. I just want to do it. If you do enough for the country, eventually the government will be like, well, okay, you are allowed to, right? But you've bought the right to being allowed to by creating your own job. Right? They only allow it in that situation. And that's what people miss is they hear you get a job at the end of the day. But what they're missing is that you've done everything necessary to create a job that didn't exist before. And then you're allowed to work it. Now, if you do all that and you give someone else the job that you created, then you're allowed to take the job that they theoretically departed. It's all economic based, right? The whole economy. So somebody is gaining a job and you're allowed to take it because you're the one that created that job. But there's no benefit to you. So no one has ever wanted to do this, but it technically exists. And the reason, we've talked about this before on the show, the reason that it technically exists is they want to have protections for people who are investing so that their activities in investment aren't perceived as working and possibly run them afoul of a working law, right? So as an investor here, I actually technically have the right to work. I am one of those people who actually can go apply for those call center jobs. I'm absolutely allowed to do that. The government knows I'm creating lots of jobs. And it knows that by doing so, by investing and creating jobs, I know that I don't want to go take the call center job. I have no interest in doing that, right? They know those things go together, but they know that I've created more jobs than I could take because I can only take one, but I created several. And I continue to create several. And they verify that I'm creating several on a regular basis so that I can maintain that visa that allows me the option of working. And so they know that the knowledge and power to get to the position where I have that visa means I know that I wouldn't want to use it to work. But they know that many of the activities that I do could be perceived as working in a particular moment. For example, I own restaurants and hotels. As an investor, it protects me. What if I was to go into my hotel and no one showed up to work today and I decided to jump in and do it myself because I couldn't find someone? Well, I'm allowed to do that. And even if you don't have a work visa, often that would be overlooked. Okay, no one showed up to work. You're not trying to take a job. You had to keep the business open. There's probably going to be a lot of soft view on that. But technically, that would run afoul of you don't have a work visa. You shouldn't be doing that, right? So they make sure that if you own a business here, that you're able to jump in and fill in any position. As illogical as it would be to want to do it as a full-time thing, needing to do it to train someone, needing to do it to manage someone, needing to do it to fill in when there's an emergency, because owners sometimes have to do that. It's just how it works in business. They want to make it that if the police showed up and said, it seems like you're working, I'm really concerned about this, or if the Department of Taxes shows up, or labor shows up and someone calls you in and they're like, they're taking a job, right? That's a Nicaraguan job that they're doing. They can be like, well, no, they own this business. They're fully certified. They have the paperwork. They're allowed to work. They would, even if they thought they wanted to do this, they will learn quickly that they don't, right? So it's an important tool to protect investors from not being able to jump in and do stuff. But investors know we don't want to be doing that work, but we may have to from moment to moment as part of our investment. But we certainly don't invest in hotels here, right? Because we want to be hotel maids, right? We don't come up with money from our home country, save up, buy into a hotel so that we can buy a minimum wage cleaning job. Right. But there could be a moment where to keep our hotel running, we have to clean something. Right. So it's an important perspective that if you haven't been an investor and haven't been in a situation where you're an investor without the right to work, that you could run into weird gray areas where something feels like you're not working per se, and it feels like you're just doing normal things to keep your business running, and somebody perceives it as they didn't get a job because you're doing that job, and then whistle blows on you, and you go, oh my gosh, I actually was working even if I didn't give myself pay. Now I'm missing minimum wage laws, and I'm violating a work visa and all kinds of things. So there's reasons that they do this, but none of those should suggest or give you any idea that you want a job in Nicaragua. So importantly, remember you don't want it, and that means do not spend any effort. Never seek out a loophole. Never look for the job that might let you work. Never look for a means of getting the law to make it look like you'd be allowed to. Never look for an excuse. That means you don't understand the fact that you don't want there to be one. Even if a loophole existed, even if I knew how you could find work, you should say, Scott, but why would I want to do that? That's the correct reaction. Not, oh, I heard I'm not allowed to work, but I think I can find a way to make it possible. That makes no sense. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Alan Miller. As always, comes directly to me. Pays for the cameras and the software and the licensing to be able to do the show every day. And remember to join us on Thursday evenings. We do a live stream almost every Thursday. When there's technical stuff, we do skip it, but we try to do it every Thursday. We're pretty good. We get at least 3 to 4 every month. So every so often there's a miss, but it's pretty reliable. We try to start around 5 or 6 Mountain Time, but we go all evening. You got many hours to jump in. It's great, but try to get there when the announcement goes out. If you don't know where to find the announcements, it will alert if you put the little bell in theory on YouTube, but even better, get in the WhatsApp of Nicaragua group that you can see the link down there in our show notes, along with lots of other social media and how to send in a video question of yourself. That is a lot of great stuff in there, a lot of ways to connect with us and find other material. Get in the comments, say hello, ask your questions there as well. And as always, I will see all of you tomorrow.